Hello, thank you very much for joining us. My name is Justyna Deszcz-Tryhubczak and I am Associate Professor at the Institute of English Studies at the University of Wrocław. And I'm also a member of the Center for Young People's Literature and Culture at the Institute of English Studies. And I'm delighted and so happy to welcome and to be here with Professor Macarena García-González from the University of Glasgow, my colleague with whom I've been working together on children's literature and culture. And let me just say that we are meeting ahead of Macarena's physical visit to Wrocław next week. And this visit is possible thanks to Excellence Initiative Research University at the University of Wrocław. And we are excited to be able to host Macarena here. And today we are going to talk a little bit about our joint research, which concerns posthumanist philosophies and their applications, or what they may inspire in children's literature and culture scholarship. But I would like now to ask Macarena to let us know a little bit about her career and her current research. She's now, let me stress this is a big achievement. She's now a postdoctoral Marie Skłodowska-Curie fellow at the University of Glasgow. So Macarena, please tell us a little bit about your work.
Well, first, thank you very much, Justyna, for the invitation to everything. I mean, to visit you at the University of Wrocław, for you and your colleagues, to visit the center, and to be part of this event that looks quite lively and with a lot of things going on at the English departments in Poland. So I'm happy to join you for this conversation about posthumanism. That is something that we have been working for some years now. And about myself, so I would first define myself as a children's literature scholar. I think that I do a lot of other things as well, but I would say that that's my main academic identity. I come from cultural studies background. So I did a master in cultural studies at the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. Then I did cultural studies and social anthropology as a doctorate in University of Zurich, Switzerland. I have worked, I would say I work in the shifting relationships between literature, cultural material, children, childhood. I would say that there's the place where I recognize myself as children's literature, children's culture scholar. I have directed different projects. I had a 4-year grant by the Chilean National Research Agency to research. It was the title was Emotional Literary Repertoires for Childhood. So they're analyzing affects and emotions in children's literature, in the circulation of children's literature, in the mediation of children's literature. So I have worked a lot on the concept of mediation. I worked for 6 years at the Center for Educational Justice, Center for Advanced Studies in Educational Justice of the Catholic University of Chile. Then I was also a principal researcher there, leading a research line on cultural studies in educational research, and actually working on always from this perspective of posthumanism and rethinking methodologies. Perhaps just one more thing about my background or my academic career that might be of interest here is that I have been a part of the executive board of what we call the International Research Society for Children's Literature. So we have been working there together. So we were in the board for 2 years with Justyna. So we also collaborated in the frame of this project. I'm now actually the person in charge of the mentoring program, which was created by her some years ago. And in the frame of this institution, that is an international institution that gathers people working in children's literature in different places and with different perspectives and from different disciplines, I was the convener of the last Congress that took place in 2021 under a quite posthumanist title. There was aesthetic and pedagogical entanglements. So we did the of entanglement. So, well, yeah, that I think is enough for now. And thank you very much for inviting me.
So let's talk about posthumanist orientations and openings a little bit. Now, very generally, we listed here, just give me a second. Yes, we listed some, let's say, lines of thought, some directions within posthumanism that interest us in particular, but this is of course just a selection. So we've been interested in the production of knowledge, and especially this production of knowledge that recenters, decenters, destabilizes the position of the human knowing subject. We've been interested in how knowledge is produced relationally, how this process is networked and distributed among more than human agencies, and how it emerges through relations, and maybe how knowledge really is about relations, in fact. We've also been interested in how posthumanism destabilizes a number of binaries and dichotomies that we are kind of used to think with. And especially we are interested in childhood, adulthood continuum, and trying to kind of think beyond, outside developmental frameworks, which is a very kind of entrenched way of thinking, entrenched in children's literature studies, right? Following these frameworks, I mean. And then we've been also very much interested in the Anthropocene, and especially the question of the future and hope for post-Anthropocene times, and where childhood and how childhood and children kind of come into this question of hoping in the first place, and then achieving, for example, ecocentric futures. Macarena, would you like to add something here, maybe?
Perhaps just to underline something, or to highlight something. This idea of the post-human knowing subject, I would say that is perhaps what brought us together in the first place. This question about how would you produce knowledge differently when you try to overcome these binaries or the Cartesian thinking, and how this is a way of thinking and organizing the world and organizing knowledge since the Enlightenment, so that posthumanism is not actually a turn in social studies or in the humanities. But it's rather like a sort of acknowledging another start, or an alternative way of thinking about what might count as knowledge, I would say. So, well, there are different ways to define what posthumanism is, and in the way that we have been working is very much when it is related to feminist new materialisms, and that tradition of thinking that comes from feminist theory and from queer studies, and how then how those has been a tradition of thinking about these continuums, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And actually, this connection with new materialism, this has been very much present in our collaborations, but we will come to this in a moment. So we need to acknowledge that we are not the only ones working with posthumanism in children's literature studies. We need to acknowledge the work of our colleagues. For example, Maria Nikolaeva's article from 2016, Recent Trends in Children's Literature Research, Return to the Body, where she mentions posthumanism as one of the crucial future directions in our field. Beside eco-criticism and disability studies and cognitive criticism. And in her article, she also mentions posthumanist characters from quite early children's books, and these characters have posthuman qualities. They don't want to be human, but they have kind of human agency, and they have human affects as well. So the point is that there has been a lot of, let's say, posthumanism, or there had been a lot of, let's say, posthumanism in a way in children's literature that predates thinking, the emergence of posthumanist philosophies. But there are, of course, other studies, and you see some examples here. So there is really a big kind of extensive body of posthumanist thought in our field. Now, in our, let's say, our approach, or in our endeavors in this respect, we actually were trying to think a lot with new materialism, as Macarena mentioned. And here's a list of our joint presentations, and also our joint publications, and among them this article, New Materialist Openings to Children's Literature Studies, which was, I think, our first attempt to work together and to try to think with new materialism and posthumanism. So Macarena, could you maybe comment a little bit on this article and our goals there? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this was an article. Actually, I was organizing a conference in Chile at the time, and Justyna was coming to Santiago because she was part of the IRCO board, and it was a conference in which the board members were visiting in Chile and were presenting. And then I noticed that she was also reading Karen Barad, and she had Karen Barad in her abstract. And then I came with this invitation to work together on new materialism and what would new materialism mean for children's literature studies. At that point, I was working a bit lonely in this, using this perspective to do this. And so when the invitation was to think about if this theoretical framework, let's call it framework. I don't think that framework is actually quite a rigid idea, but well, at the beginning, entering into this philosophy, we could say, how would this open space for other ways of doing children's literature studies? So that was the starting point. And then we thought a lot on this idea of the openings and on the article being an invitation to scholars in our field, but actually an invitation to ourselves to just venture into other territories, if you want. So what we did in that article was in a way reviewing and looking at the ways in which we were, I would say at that point, we could see like the first elaborations, conceptual elaborations, as what Justyna has just shown of our field engaging with posthumanism, and then think what else might posthumanism do to our research. Then we realized that there's this very important that we needed to push this thinking out of the what we call the developmental trap. So thinking out of developmental psychology with everything that it brings about children growing up, about milestones of growing up, about children being being those that develop and change, whereas we think of adults as fixed and finished, you know. So how to think beyond or how to think out of developmentalism in general that is so prevalent in childhood studies and the conceptualizations and imaginations of childhood in general. Then thinking about what could we do if we think about agencies in our field and about agencies as not just restricted to the human, but agencies relying on the relations, agencies related on the connections and the interactions. So what would that be? And then we opened questions as to whether we could see what happens what would happen if we would think that books may have a certain, we use the concept of Jane Bennett's would be vibrant matter, would have an agency in themselves. What if we think that books would read us, for example, or this porousness between books and readers? So to stop or to provide concepts to think something that in literary studies and in children's literature studies, we have either an approximation, and we either do literary criticism with doing a textual analysis, or and that's something that happens mostly in education departments, or we have like a look into how do children respond to the books, and we have then reader response theory being developed. But we appear so far unable to think about this porosity and about how they do interact and they make each other. So what we did in this article was offering what at the end we called a toolbox. So pointing out several concepts that we thought that could be useful for us and for our colleagues to kind of build on. And that's what we have been trying after that article, to be building on that and developing other concepts and put ourselves, I would say, into other sort of trouble. Mm-hmm. Or more trouble.
Okay, but so this was our joint collaboration, but let's talk a little bit about our beginnings. So Macarena, how in the first place you became interested in new materialism and post-humanist philosophies?
I was first interested when I was working on this article. That is the first one here in the slide. an article about cultural materials about state violence, let's say dictatorship, state violence in Chile, and how do cultural materials for children would negotiate, we could say in like a traditional way, would negotiate a difficult subject with children. And one thing that I looked at that time was everything that has been written about memory and Holocaust, for instance. Seemed like kind of similar, difficult matter, and how would you deal with that? And then we have a lot of reflections about this idea of the gap, so that these are texts that leave gaps that are open in order to be filled in by the adults that would read alongside the children, and then they would decide how much context of information would come up. But I was kind of like feeling myself like short of concepts to deal with this, and that there was something about the materiality of the text and the affects, I would say, an affective dimension, not even a dimension, but an intensity that was there that I couldn't acknowledge with the traditional tools that I would have. And then I started reading first Gumbrecht and his idea of presence, and then I came to Karen Barad, and for instance, the concept of interaction, the concept of space-time mattering, became like something like lights there that would at least point out that it couldn't be closed that easily, or that there was something more complex going on there. Mm-hmm. But I would say that that's just like a starting point, and that I just got into it then when I started working at this Center for Advanced Studies in Educational Justice. There is an interdisciplinary research center with people working from very different disciplines, but I was like the other one, like coming from the humanities, let's say. But within a group of very open-minded people and very adventurous people, I would say, that were reading a lot of feminist new materialism and posthumanism in order to rethink educational research and then empirical research. And that kind of like blew my mind, because that meant also that literary work, literary studies could be done differently and could be nurtured by empirical research. And well, then these other three articles that are listed here are part of these of other research projects in which we dealt with that. So yeah, I think that something that was very important then was to be part of a group, actually, and to be reading alongside other ones, and to be able, especially for those that were working on the doctoral projects, to be able like to kind of like care for these projects in order that they could like be able to embody what they were, the way that they were thinking about it. So yeah, and what about you? What about you, and who was there?
Yeah, for me, I think it was my participatory research with children as partners in research, as co-creating the research process, shaping it along the way, its all components. And in one of these projects, which I describe in this article listed here, the children that I worked with decided to do a film adaptation of a novel that we were discussing, and they started to work on it. And then as I was observing their work and also participating in it, I was part of the film. I am in the film, in fact, that they produced. I started to notice a lot of other agencies at work beyond or apart from human agencies involved. First of all, it was indeed the agency of the book. I really thought at some point that the book was reading us and that it was making us do some things. It's about the choices of characters, the choices of costumes, of settings, and so on. And then the particular spaces at the school, the weather, the wind, some sounds that occurred at the moment of filming, some toys that were there available and used by the children. I think it all meant that there were, once again, a lot of other agencies involved. So I think that was this multiplicity of these forces at work was something that fascinated me. And I think also just the process itself. At some point, it was really taking such a long time, and I wasn't really sure at all whether we would reach some kind of conclusion with this research, but I think it didn't matter anymore so much. What mattered were also our entanglements, the effects that emerged in this process, the joy, but the frustration as well, the energy that was there, that was shared among humans and more than humans involved. So I think that's how it started for me, and then we started to work together, and I was able to again read quite a lot and also think with Macarena and on my own about all these directions, possibilities, and concepts. So let us talk a little bit about our current project. This is actually a collected volume, Children's Cultures After Childhood, or After Childhoods, in fact. It is now being reviewed, but we are quite hopeful. And it has been a fascinating project, also because of, I think, the scope and the colleagues that have joined us and have responded to our invitation. So Macarena, could you maybe briefly just try to summarize it if it's at all possible, and maybe talk a little bit about this concept of after childhood as well?
Yeah, well, it's quite a hard book it's difficult to summarize, but I would say, well, we thought if what we were doing was an invitation, it made sense to invite in the ways that we academics do, right? We invite for books. So we open a book to have this conversation, and we received several very different contributions. So it has been quite a fun, interesting, I would say, journey with them, because some colleagues were already working with posthumanism and new materialisms. Others were just intrigued and wanted to try it out. And some of them, for instance, are revisiting data that they have analyzed in a traditional qualitative way, and then they want to try this other way because there was something that they feel that has been left out. And I think that that's something that happens to a lot of us when we get into this. It's like, well, this really helps me to get this sticky data that is there, but otherwise I wouldn't know how to read it. So we have quite a range of different contributions. So I'm really excited about the book. And way that we bring them together, because then we have like people working on TV, on toys, on newspapers. There are kind of historical approaches. There are more.
We have a creator as well, right? One of them is actually a picture book author.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah. So and we have like very early career consolidated authors. So we have quite a range of approaches to the question. And then the question itself, children's cultures, is also quite open, right? So what we do is that we first provide a definition of children's cultures and why we think that this is a term that we should be using more. And then we propose to use this concept of the after childhood. There is a concept by Peter Kraftel about the possibilities of using the concept of the child. And I'm not going to get into detail here because it might be too abstract, but the possibilities of using the concept of the child in research about cultural materials by children, by moving in and out of focus the child and being able to then show more entanglements. And this, of course, comes from a bigger discussion on childhood studies, to which we want also to contribute. So it's part of for us, I would say, an important ongoing conversation between children's literature and culture studies and childhood studies, and how we can contribute to childhood studies and not just be kind of learning from childhood studies, but there's sort of like, because we have been working with cultural materials, we have had other access to this very complex question about what is a child. So yeah, we are dealing with that in various ways in this book.
And there are also kind of other presences as well in the book, more than human presences, real fictional animals, insects, if I recall, plants, fabric, all sorts of fabric as well. So fabrics. So that's it's a really very interesting project altogether. And then our other, another kind of current project is kind of reflection on the co-production of childhood and futures. So how can we I mean, this kind of thinking about possible futures, better times, better spaces, involving thinking about children, and especially thinking about children as saviors of humanity, as custodians of the future, as this kind of force that will, some scholars put it, lead us towards post-Anthropocene times. And we've been thinking about these questions with a story by Donna Haraway, the Camille Stories, which is part of Staying with the Troublemaking King in the Thulucine. That's a scholarly book by Haraway, and this is the Camille Stories is the final chapter in this book. And very briefly, we have a kind of projection into the future where the size of the human population has been reduced. It's a devastated planet that humanity lives on. And this kind of new kind of children, let's say, is created, emerges. So it's a human child, but living in a kind of symbiosis with an animal species. And in this case, it's monarch butterflies. So Haraway calls these children Camille's, and in a way imagines 5 generations of these children, and they acquire monarch butterflies qualities, and that happens even before birth. So we are looking at this story with what we would call a childist perspective, which means that we are interested in what happens to the child. What happens to the child's agency, to the choices that this child has in her community, and we are again asking this question whether it would be possible to imagine a future, or this transition towards some kind of future, hopefully a better future, but without instrumentalizing the child, without scapegoating the child. In the story, we can see that these Camille's, they really are part of this bigger project, and they don't kind of exist in a way apart or beyond this project. Macarena, would you like to add something here?
No, I would just probably again highlight something. This is part of the way of thinking about the future and children's literature. And let's say of a way which we want to bring a more complex question about how is that our field is so deeply entangled in this production of the better citizen in general. So we have children's literature always being entangled with discourses and affectivities. I would say even it's more an affect about hope, and that children, if they read these books, they will do it a certain way. And that comes a lot in all these books about climate crisis, but not only, right? So we published a blog post about this in a blog. So that was first, before this, we started with the Camille Stories, blog on reimagining childhood studies, a blog post about this problem about the future. And we even used the term of slow violence, right? There's a slow violence in this production of the hope with the burden in the child, and with children's literature as a medium for that, as a medium. So that's also why we're interested in like shifting a focus and talking about children's cultures. That appears to be less of an ideological project, or the project appears to be a little bit more free. It's a bit more open, let's say. So this is part of this reflection in which we have no answer, and that's been part of the problem of this. So we invite colleagues, scholars to speculate with us, what would a possible story be? And we end up talking about the difficulty to write another sort of story, or how would we make a story about this? So it's more here paraphrasing Haraway's title. It's more about our commitment to stay with the trouble, I would say, and try to think about the problem that we are doing when we produce the future that way. And again, to something that has brought our paths together, I would say that is the question about adultism in the first place, right? Or the adult-centric culture, and how can we do that? And then it's your work with participatory research, has been my work, always very critical of like, how is that we decide what children should read or not, and how do we censor, and all those intensities around that. So it has to do like, how how may we talk about the future without reproducing these once and again, right? So yeah, this is part of like a laboratory, I would say, about that.
Yeah, we are continuing asking students as well, kind of doing little experiments with this story. So we encourage you to have a look at it. And finally, we would just like, I mean, this conversation has been also a kind of inspiration for us to think about our future common passions. Common passion is also a concept that we've been thinking a lot with, and it's actually a very nice concept to kind of to express our joint collaborations, but of course this happens for many colleagues, for many researchers. So it's not just about joint research, but also about all sorts of energies, affects, passions indeed that emerge in the process, and the passions in a way help us to move on and to find new concepts, new directions to work with. So definitely this question of hope for a better future. Yes, Macarena, of course.
I would say that there's something important about common passions that is about putting ourselves in the position to be affected. That I think is kind of just wanted to add that.
Be vulnerable as well, to kind of be willing maybe to let go and be part of the relationalities. And whatever they bring. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I do agree. So yeah, coming back to these ideas that we have, of course, this question of hope for a better future. For myself also, I think this interest in knowledge production with more than humans. Of course, that's a big field. I guess it begs the question. It's intriguing, but we don't have time to go into details here. But well, if we could open this process, especially in our field, children's literature and culture, to research with, for example, animals or plants. So it's about this broader idea of recentering, decentering, destabilizing the human knowing subject. And then Macarena, you've been working with this idea of collaboratories. So if you could just briefly talk about this. It's a current project. Well,
it's a current project. It's in the frame of the Child Cultures project. That is my current Marie Curie postdoctoral project. It has to do with about thinking about where knowledge might be made more than where it comes from. What can we make to interact to produce new knowledge? And then starts from this question about participation, then collaboration, and all these frameworks about including other subjects on research and making other voices, representing voices or visions of the world. And that I don't want to be critical to that. It's research that has been very important for shifting our academic cultures, I would say. But they are always in a way, they always end up a bit in a cul-de-sac with the question of like, who is the one that has the power over the research, and how is that I represent or I decide what is participation is. So then I've been thinking about what if we think about collaborations in a much freer way, if you want, about laboratories. They are laboratories with a testing ground, but then the emphasis is totally on the process and not on any kind of result. And then what can we bring to this laboratory? I think that this laboratory is also interesting because laboratories are made of a lot of non-human agencies. So they are not laboratories where things interact with things and make things. So it's about thinking how is we think this way to rethink mainly, I would say, the problem of the intergenerational. The problem is not a problem, the gift, if you want, but there's also like a problem there of the intergenerational framework or intergenerational collaboration, or how may we think about these entangled forces that are transversed by age, but by many other things at the same time.
Yeah, sounds so fascinating, and I know this is the subject of your current project, so I'm really thrilled to be following your research and just looking at how it works. It's going to work. So we need to finish right now. So we want to encourage you to join this conversation. If you have any questions, please get in touch with us. And Macarena, thank you so much for participating in the English Department's Night 2022 in this way. Once again, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us again.
Thank you. Thank you all for listening.